Welcome to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I have probably one of my favorite pumpkin projects I have ever done. I'm going to take a normal craft store foam pumpkin and I'm going to turn it into a D&D inspired mimic. And I'll be honest with you, I am absolutely thrilled with how this project came out, and it was a lot easier than I anticipated. So a couple of years ago, I did a video on how to carve into one of these foam pumpkins, how to light it, and all you really need is a heat knife. But it looked kind of generic. So I was like, what can I do to up my game on it? And so this year, I took that same basic principle of carving into it, cutting it apart, but I added some of my HD foam, some of my round dowels, and some of my foam clay to really bring this thing to life. So I want to show you what it takes to put a pumpkin like this together, because I want you to be inspired by it. You don't have to necessarily make the thing that I make, but I want you to go out, get a foam pumpkin, get some foam clay, get some EVA foam, and really make this project your own. A couple weeks ago, I picked up a 12-inch carvable pumpkin from Lowe's. Not knowing exactly what I'm going to do, I sketch out a basic idea. Using a scalpel blade on my heat tool as well as my respirator, I can start to carve away the mouth of the pumpkin. Now in this cutting process on the video, I'm going about 4 times the speed. So as long as you're going slow and steady, the heat tool should be able to cut through the pumpkin really well. To bulk out the gums for my mimic, I'm going to start by wrapping some 4mm HD foam around the bottom jaw. This is applied to the pumpkin by using some weldwood contact cement and some super glue. The same process of bulking out the gums was also done to the top. To bulk out the interior of the gums, I glue in some strips of 10mm foam. Now these don't need to be exact because I'm going to sand them down to the shape I want later on. At this point I determined I wanted the mouth of my mimic to be considerably larger. So I once again used my heat tool to open the mouth and remove the upper jaw. And once I kind of saw the placement of where this was going to go, I opened the mouth even more on either side. To make this upper section fit the pumpkin a little bit better, I'm going to use my rotary tool to sand away the inside. This was also a good time to sand the 10mm foam flush for the gums. Additional superglue is then used to attach this section to the pumpkin. Now I'm not really worried about this seam here because I'm going to fill it with some foam clay and sculpt additional details on top. With the top of the mouth in its new position, I'm going to do this same process to the bottom jaw. This piece was also heat cut, sanded, and then glued onto the lower section of the pumpkin. The teeth are going to be made using my 20mm HD foam round dowels, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and there is a link in the description section. These dowels were cut to length, rough shaped with a utility knife, and then cleaned up using a rotary tool. All the teeth vary in size 2 to 3 inches in length. After all the teeth have been sanded, I then use my heat gun to seal the foam. To make the teeth sit at different angles, I'll randomly cut the bottoms and then I'll glue them onto the gums. The main thing I'm going for here is for them to look very random and scary. For some variety in the teeth size, I also use some 15mm and 10mm round dowels. These were detailed in the same way by rough cutting them first and then sanding them into shape. After the teeth had been heat sealed, they could be glued onto the mouth. Now most of these went on either side and some of them were glued behind the larger teeth. Now here's where your creativity really comes into play, because I'm going to be using my foam clay to build up the gums and fill the seams. This foam clay is my own line and an air dry material that you can find over at Blick Art Materials. Again, I have links in the description section. For those that haven't worked with it before, you wet the surface of the material and that helps adhere the foam clay. You can then use your fingers or various sculpting tools to push the material around. After about an hour to an hour and a half, the foam clay will skin over, and at this point you just kind of want to leave it alone for about 24 to 48 hours. After that dry time, you can then add additional foam clay to it, or you can start sculpting into it with a rotary tool. For the eyes of my mimic, I'm going to be using some half-round glass domes. Hot glue is applied to some red paper and the half rounds are firmly pressed down. And here you can see the red paper glued behind gives a nice little effect to the glass. These domes can then be glued onto the skinned over foam clay with some super glue. Since it's been about a day, the foam clay has set up enough that I can start adding additional foam clay without distorting the original sculpture. Here's where I really try to focus more on building up the foam clay around the eyes and his gums. The foam clay is rolled into small cylinders and then pressed onto the surface. I could then use silicone tip tools or round tools to blend it into the sculpt that I had done yesterday. This build-up process was also done around each tooth in the gum line. Now I decided I wanted my Mimic to have a tongue, and I'm going to use some 14 gauge wire to get a basic shape. The basic shape of the tongue can then be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. 2mm strips of foam are then used to adhere the wire to this piece. I could then go in and refine the shape to match the scale of my pumpkin, and the thing that's great about the wire is it allows this tongue to be somewhat posable. I once again trace around the tongue, this time onto some 4mm foam. This piece is going to be glued to the underside of the tongue using some contact cement and some super glue. Now notice here there's a lot of overhang, so once that's trimmed away, I can then use my rotary tool to refine the shape. Here I'm just trying to round the tongue over while also adding some detail shapes to the center. I go ahead and check the tongue for fit, and it's looking pretty good. While I was looking at the tongue, I saw the sides of the mouth were a little too open, so I'm going to add some webbing on the inside similar to a snake. I drafted a quick pattern and I cut this piece out of some 6mm foam. I then took my rotary tool to sand it down and gave it some organic shaping. Once I was satisfied with the sizing and it was heat sealed, I could then glue these into place on either side. Because these pieces were slightly visible, I once again used some foam clay to act as a transition between these pieces and the interior of the pumpkin. While I allowed that to dry, I used some additional foam clay to make some cylinders to act as veins for the sides and the bottom of the tongue. And even though it's not necessary, I decided to use the tip of a pen to simulate some taste buds. While the foam clay dried, I worked on other parts of the pumpkin, so here you can see I used my rotary tool to rough up and add some additional textures to the stem. I trimmed the size of the tongue so it fit a little bit better, and then I used some super glue to glue it to the bottom of the pumpkin. Once the adhesive had cured, I then used some Krylon red oxide primer to paint the inside. Before I paint the exterior, I put some masking tape over all of the glass eyes. With the HD foam and the foam clay all primed, I'm now going to use some Flex Bond to seal it. The Flex Bond is thinned with some water and then painted onto all of the foam surfaces using a filbert brush. The sealer goes on white, but after it dries, and in this case I'm going to use a hairdryer to speed that up, it will eventually go clear. Now I can blend all of these surfaces into the pumpkin, and I'm going to start by using some Liquitex Cadmium Orange. I'm not using much water to push this paint around, and cadmiums in general cover really well. To give this pumpkin an even better blend, I'm going to break out my airbrush, and I'm going to use some Createx Transparent Orange and Opaque Yellow. These colors are mixed together until I get a value that's pretty close to the pumpkin itself. The airbrush is used on all the areas that I had sculpted, as well as the rind lines on the back of the pumpkin. For the Mimic's tongue and gums, I'm going to use some Createx Transparent Purple. I'm using the Transparent series because I want some of those original colors from the primer to still show through. These different values and layers in the colors will make it more believable in the end. Now the transparent gave off a little bit of a gloss that I didn't want yet, so I sealed everything using a Valspar clear flat spray. To paint all of his teeth, I'm going to start with a base color of Liquitex Raw Sienna. This is watered down and applied with a small filbert brush, making sure that that gum line was super clean. While I allowed the teeth to dry, I mixed up more cadmium orange to paint around his eyes and the stem. To highlight his teeth, I'm going to start by creating a mixture of unbleached titanium and cadmium-free yellow medium. No water is added to this mixture so it can pick up the textures on the teeth. For a final highlight, just unbleached titanium is painted onto the tips of the teeth. Now it's time to grunge this pumpkin up, and to do that I'm going to make a wash out of raw umber and Mars Black. This is going to be a very wet wash applied to the surface with a 1-inch mop brush. Once the surface has been coated, I then go in with a damp paper towel and wipe off a lot of the excess paint. This allows the paint to stain the surface slightly, but it gets down into all those little nooks and crannies that I had sculpted onto the pumpkin earlier. The stem was also painted with this dark mixture, but not as much water. I wanted the pigment to be more opaque, even though some of this will also be wiped away. To highlight the Mimic's gums and his tongue, I'm going to water down some Liquitex Brilliant Purple. This is also going to be shot through my Iwata airbrush, but it's an extremely transparent layer. I decided I wanted a little more contrast on the tongue itself, so I'm going to be using some FX brand metallic blue on the tip. Now this paint is pretty thin on its own, so I don't need to water it down and I can apply it directly to the tongue. Once the paintbrush was almost dry, I then added a little more pigment further up. Now the Mimic is looking great, but I want to take it over the top by adding some gloss to the teeth and the tongue. And to do that, I'm going to be using some JB Weld 5-minute epoxy. I mix part A and B together, and then I use a chip brush to apply the mixture directly to the prop. In this case, the teeth each receive a coating. But then I'll go back and stipple the chip brush onto the gums to simulate some splatter. The stipple process was also applied to the tongue, hoping that it would simulate kind of more of those taste buds that I had put on earlier. After some additional epoxy was placed at the sides of his mouth and around his eyes, this Mimic is complete. So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own D&D inspired Foam Pumpkin Mimic. And again, the whole point to this video is to be inspirational. I want you to go out, get yourself a pumpkin, have fun with this process. This is the type of thing that you can do as a family, put it together. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.